Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi, to a video about Venti and the changes he's received. I'm going to be making a video for all of the witch characters that are getting a buff. I'll also make one about Durin, but this is going to be the pre-release video. But this is going to serve as the equivalent of a pre-release for the buffs, in which I talk about the changes and how good they are, where you can use them. Let's just get right into it. First, we need to talk about the changes that Venti is receiving. Venti is receiving two major changes. One, they are making his burst just do more damage in general when there are two witches on the team. If a character triggers Swirl while Venti's burst is active, they gain 50% damage percent for the next 4 seconds, and Venti's burst motion value is increased by 35%. Venti can get that effect from off-field, it seems, from the wording, so he just gets 50 damage percent and 35 more motion value on his burst. Pretty solid, right? It's 135% multiplier, it's not plus 35, but it basically just means that his burst does a third more damage on top of the additional stat from the 50 damage percent. That's a buff to Venti in general, but they're also giving Venti a buff by introducing a carry playstyle on him. After Venti has used his burst, while his burst is active, he gets an Animo Infusion on his normal attacks, and their damage is multiplied by 2.5. If he does normal attacks while his burst is active, it can slightly extend the burst duration by up to 2 seconds. It's 1 second per attack, so it's something you want to do even on support Venti now. You want to do 2 normal attacks before you swap out to extend your burst duration by 2 seconds, but other than that, he's now going to have an actual carry playstyle. How good will that carry playstyle be? Honestly, it's not amazing, but it's also not awful. Right now, if you look at how the meta has been shaping up in the past few months / like a year and a half, they've gone pretty hard with the power creep, and you look at like the good Natlan carries, the good Nodcry carries now as well. Like the good ones are pretty comfortably above 100k. None of the Venti teams I've looked at so far are honestly close to 100k. The closest I got was like almost 90k, but that was a little optimistic for things, honestly. And realistically, what you can probably expect out of Venti teams are Venti carry teams will be fairly similar in output to the teams of the Animo carries that are currently out. So Xiao, Wanderer. Maybe a tiny little bit better than the current ones, but Venti as a support will now be good for those Animo carries because he buffs the damage percent of characters that trigger Swirl, and also he does more off-field damage. So if you're against enemies that don't get lifted by his burst, and you can use him with Xiao. If you're against enemies that do get lifted by his burst, you can still use him with Wanderer, and those teams are also a little bit better than the current strongest Animo carry teams. All in all, the Venti buffs are just a tiny little upscale to Animo damage dealers as a whole, both to him, like his as a carry, and to other Animo carries using him as a support. But honestly, I think that out of the Hexen Circle buffs, Venti is probably the one that's the least impactful right now. There's also the Sucrose buff that doesn't do that much, but at least Sucrose was already used in a lot of very good meta teams, so it'll still be a tiny little buff to those. When it comes to Venti, I don't think this is enough to bring him to a level where he's like actively someone you want to put on your team in general, but when there's content where Venti's grouping is valuable, it'll feel a lot less bad to put him on your team. It's not going to feel like you're sacrificing a lot to put him on your team, and you can kind of slot him anywhere, just the same way you'd slot in any other Animo unit. And because he has a lot more damage now, even though he still doesn't have a buff to non-Animo carries other than his energy restoration, which can be difficult to reliably get on the right element, it's still not going to feel too bad to use. Honestly, if anything, this kind of just feels bad for Kazuha, who is already a little on a path towards getting forgotten. The main thing about Venti's changes, though, is that his buff to his normal attack stays active throughout his burst duration, even if you swap out, which means I honestly expect the Venti buffs to be balanced around Varka. I fully expect Varka to end up being a carry whose best team includes Venti. The way they could do that is, I mean, there's a few options for how they could do that. They could, one, just directly say, hey, Varka is a witch lover, okay? And he gains something based on the amount of Hexen Circle party members you have. And it's not capped to 2. But they don't have to do something like that, because with the release of Durin, we're getting another alternative to Farazan for Shred in Animo carries teams. When I was looking at all the Venti teams you could do, either for Venti carry or for Venti support with someone else, there was honestly not that big of a difference between the teams that did like Venti, Bennett, Farazan, Durin, or Bennett, Fischl, Durin, Bennett, Albedo, Durin. There's very much a possibility for Varka teams not to be that reliant on Farazan. And for the animal carries, I've looked a lot at the main core being Venti, Farazan, Durin. But honestly, replacing Venti seemed to yield similar results to replacing Farazan, except replacing Venti makes you lose grouping. So if Varka cares about the grouping at all, he might actually just want to have Venti in his optimal team. I was also pleasantly surprised by how Heizou looked with Venti. From what I've mentioned earlier, of Venti being allowed to swap out during his burst and still maintain the buffs to his normal attacks, there's a very real possibility that Varka's playstyle is going to be kind of quick swappy, just like Heizou, because it kind of feels like that's what they're leading to, with Durin's buff pretty much lasting forever, with Venti allowing you to swap whenever you want, with Albedo being good in those teams. I could see something like that being good. I'm kind of excited to see how they're going to go about all of this. Yeah, when it comes to just the motion values or the like talent multipliers on Venti, if you on-field Venti, he's got about 45% normal attacks, 35% burst, and like 20% skill. But that means that if you don't on-field him, you don't lose all of his damage. You still get a good amount of damage from the burst. But yeah, in terms of total motion value output, he actually has more than the other animal carries, right? You compare him to Wanderer, you compare him to Xiao. With similar field time, him versus Wanderer, both using burst, he just has outright more motion value. Same with Xiao. But the difference between the two is that, well, there's a lot of other factors that go into all of this. Wanderer isn't necessarily reliant on his burst. Xiao, outside of the motion value, has a lot of self buffs that can be impactful. Xiao can be used in longer rotations, but it also means that shorter buff uptime can be a bit of a problem. All in all, just looking at the damage output they have in their like optimal setups as hyper carries, if you try to just maximize their own personal damage, there isn't that big of a difference between all of them. Wanderer is a little bit behind the other two, but it's not that big of a deal, honestly. We have had leaks about the next Stygian onslaught, and it seems like one of the bosses is kind of designed to sell Venti, where they summon groupable things. If you group the things, the boss loses animal resistance, so it's like actually supposed to be Venti carry. Honestly though, compared to like very recent characters, even post-buff Venti's numbers aren't that impressive. I think it's very possible that Venti will be like the best carry against that specific boss, but I don't think he'll be the only one that'll work, and I definitely don't think it's necessarily worth going for Venti just because of that. I do expect Venti to be good in Varka's teams, but I think unless Varka outright has a passive that requires you to have only witches with him, I don't expect the difference between Venti and the alternatives to be that big. Yeah, Venti did get a new signature as well. The signature is like pretty solid, right? It's a high base attack crit stat stick that also just has pretty much 60 all damage percent. It's pretty solid for a signature, but it's not like it's significantly better than other recent signature weapons. I've seen a lot of people bat the hell out of this new weapon. Like it's good, but it's not anything special at this point. But yeah, you can use Venti as a support core with another witch for carries that are not Animo, right? You can just use him as your VV. But the biggest problem that he has in those teams is that there's just not that many teams that care too much about just getting VV. If you're looking at Electro carries, he's competing with Chevalers, which is pretty harsh competition, especially now that Durin gives you even more shred in the Chevalers teams if you want that. But also, you got Maoika that exists. For Pyro carries, he's also competing with Chevalers, so that can also be rough. For Cryo carries, he's competing with Escoffier. Now, could you consider Venti in a melt team for Cryo carries? You could, but getting a Cryo Swirl and a Pyro Infused Burst tends to be a bit rough, so it's not something I'd be too optimistic about. So that mainly leaves Hydro carries, but Hydro carries have like Molani, who wants to vape, and like Neuvillette, who does kind of like the Venti stuff, but part of what makes Venti good in teams where he's used optimally is the energy refund he gives to infused elements, and if you're playing Neuvillette Farina, you don't need that energy at all. So he's mainly going to be noticeable for Neuvillette solo Hydro teams, but those teams aren't that great to begin with. It should bridge the gap even more between the Neuvillette teams that have Farina and the ones that don't, which is nice for people that have Venti and don't like Farina, or just don't want to get her for whatever reason. But unfortunately, VV as a whole is getting less and less significant, and the teams that still actively want to run VV nowadays, it's not that they want to run VV in general, it's that there's a specific VV unit Sucrose that they really synergize well with. And unfortunately, Venti's buffs don't tend to be enough to knock Sucrose out. It remains to be seen if they ever release more witches that synergize well with Venti. Honestly, I kind of hope that they add a 15 energy refund to all Animo units on his passive, because right now he restores energy to himself and to characters of the element he absorbed on his burst. If he absorbed Pyro, it'll be 15 energy to Pyro characters. I kind of wish he also generated 15 energy for Animo characters by default, because I think it would just make a lot of sense for him to do that. All in all, like I said, the Venti changes are probably the least significant ones on the meta as a whole, because it's giving pretty big buffs to Venti carry teams, but Venti carries weren't that good to begin with, and they're not being buffed to the point of being strong meta teams. As usual, I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned a thing or two, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.